He swore he would never become his father. At 58, Keith Urban's life has been rewritten in ways almost no one saw coming. We know him as a chart-topping guitarist, a man worth hundreds of millions, half of one of Hollywood's most watched marriages. But behind the sold-out arenas is a story that started in a small, tense house in New Zealand and a battle he has spent decades fighting in public. Stay with me, because the real story of Keith Urban is more complicated than the headlines ever let on. Keith Urban was born in New Zealand and moved to Australia with his family when he was just 2 years old. His father, Robert, ran a small convenience store. To customers, he was a hardworking, well-liked man. At home, according to what Keith has said in interviews over the years, the atmosphere was heavier. Keith has spoken candidly about growing up with an alcoholic father, describing a childhood that shaped him far more than the polished image of a country star ever suggests. At 6 years old, Keith picked up a guitar for the first time. He has said, many times, that music became the place he felt safe. It wasn't a hobby that happened to turn into a career, it was survival. His mother began driving him to small talent contests, tiny stages in local halls, nothing glamorous. But for a child who didn't feel steady at home, that applause meant something entirely different than fame. It meant control. It meant he had built something no one could take from him. By the time Keith was a teenager, he was already performing seriously, chasing something bigger than the small towns of Queensland could offer. In 1990, he formed a band called The Ranch. It was supposed to be his breakthrough. Instead, the debut album barely sold, and the band fell apart. For a young musician who had staked everything on this, it was a gut punch. But it didn't stop him. In 1992, Keith Urban left Australia for Nashville, Tennessee, the epicenter of country music, and a city that chews up thousands of hopefuls a year. He arrived with a guitar, a few suitcases, and no contract, no team, no guarantee of anything. What followed were years of rejection, demo tapes sent to labels that never called back, bar gigs in front of audiences who barely looked up. The gap between the dream and the reality was brutal, and this is where the story turns into something Keith has been remarkably open about for over 2 decades, addiction. By the late 1990s, Keith was cycling through alcohol and cocaine use, a pattern he has directly linked, in interviews, to the environment he grew up in and to the exact thing he once swore he'd avoid. In 1998, that cycle brought him to a breaking point. Keith has spoken about hitting rock bottom and finally admitting he no longer had control. He entered the Cumberland Heights Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. Going through months of intensive treatment, he has said, in his own words, that those sessions forced him to face his father, his childhood, and the fear that he was simply repeating a pattern he never chose. Cumberland Heights kept him sober for a period, but the risk of relapse, as it does for so many people, never fully disappeared. During this same era, Keith also survived a serious motorcycle accident while under the influence, an experience he has described as a moment that shook him to his core. Through all of it, he kept writing. Songs like You're Not My God came directly out of this period. Keith has described the track as a confrontation with his own addiction, almost a conversation with the thing trying to control his life. Then, in the early 2000s, everything shifted. In 2002, his album Golden Road gave him his first major hits and his first Grammy. He was finally being recognized in the country world he'd fought so hard to break into. And then, at an event in Los Angeles for Australian expats, he met Nicole Kidman. Kidman, fresh off an Academy Award and a very public divorce from Tom Cruise, was, by any measure, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. Keith has described their connection as immediate. Within just over a year, they were engaged. In June 2006, they married in Sydney in a wedding attended by family, friends, and a long list of famous faces. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale, the Hollywood A-lister and the country outlaw finding each other against all odds. But addiction doesn't disappear because love shows up. Only months after the wedding, Keith relapsed. This part of the story is confirmed by both Keith and Nicole themselves in multiple interviews over the years. In 2006, Nicole organized an intervention, and Keith checked into the Betty Ford Center in California for treatment. He has said publicly that what scared him most wasn't losing his career, it was losing her. The tabloids at the time speculated the marriage wouldn't survive the scandal. It did. Nicole stayed. Keith got sober. And that period became, in both of their retellings, the foundation the rest of their marriage was built on. For years afterward, their relationship was held up as one of the more stable partnerships in an industry that rarely offers stability. They built a family. They weathered his career highs, her film career, the ordinary pressures of two extremely famous people trying to raise two daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret. Largely out of the spotlight. Lost, though. Kept finding him. In 2015, Keith's father, Robert, passed away after battling cancer. Keith has spoken about the complicated grief of losing a parent who caused him real pain and also gave him the thing that saved his life: music. Around this period, he wrote and released Break the Chain, a song explicitly about breaking cycles of pain passed down through generations. It wasn't subtle. It was Keith, once again, putting the most private part of his story directly into his art. In 2021, his longtime tour manager, Randy "Bagga" Fletcher, died suddenly. Crew members have described Keith going on stage that same night and telling the audience directly that they'd lost someone close to him. In 2024, Nicole's mother, Nicole Kidman, passed away as well, and both Keith and Nicole scaled back work commitments during that time to be with family. And then came 2025, the year that changed the narrative around Keith Urban entirely. On September 30, 2025, Nicole Kidman filed for divorce in Nashville after nearly 19 years of marriage. The filing cited irreconcilable differences for a couple that had publicly represented survival of addiction, of fame, of everything the industry throws at people. The news landed as a genuine shock to fans who had followed their story for 2 decades. This is where I have to be careful with you, because in the weeks after the filing, a lot of speculation flooded entertainment media: claims about affairs, about drug use, about new relationships. Much of that reporting has been denied by the people involved and isn't independently confirmed. What is confirmed on the record is this: the marriage ended after 19 years. Keith's longtime manager of 25 years, Gary Borman, also ended their professional partnership around this same period. And Keith has since scaled back his touring schedule. In 2026, rather than mounting another massive world tour, Keith chose something smaller: residency-style shows, individual festival dates, a quieter approach to performing. In the interviews he's given about this shift, he's described wanting to simplify his relationship with music, to get back to the feeling of being a live performer rather than someone constantly chasing the next album cycle. He's talked about reading more poetry lately, saying it helps him slow down. What's remarkable, when you step back and look at the whole arc, isn't that Keith Urban has struggled. Plenty of people do. What's remarkable is how much of it he chose to talk about. On the record, in his own words, for over 20 years: the alcoholic father, the addiction, the rehab stays, the fear of becoming a man he didn't want to become. Long before this year's headlines, he had already been telling this story. At 58, after 2 decades of one of the most public marriages in music, after losing his father, his longtime manager, and people who'd stood beside him since the beginning, Keith Urban is still doing the one thing that has never stopped being true about him. He's still walking on stage, still playing guitar, still writing songs about exactly what he's going through, the same way he did as a 10-year-old kid trying to make sense of a house that didn't always feel safe. Sometimes the most honest measure of a person isn't whether they fell, it's what they kept doing afterward. If this look at Keith Urban's real story resonated with you, let me know in the comments what part surprised you most, and subscribe for more deep dives into the true stories behind the artists we think we already know.